Jo. It's so good to see you again. And thank you for sharing and being with us here today from your studio and home in Santa Fe. And I know today we wanted to talk about your work and particularly your exhibition that you had at the George O'Keeffe Museum, which I find really fascinating. Knowing your work and the fact that we've shown it at MOPA, not only a one-person show. I can't believe it was, what, 2010?
Something like that.
Yeah. But also because we have collectors and we have work of yours in our collection, we've included it in a number of exhibitions over time. So I thought today would be a great opportunity for us to talk about that project and what you're working on these days. And why don't you give us a little bit of your background as well? Because I think that's really important for people to understand.
Okay, so my training was in painting. I got a MFA in painting from UC Berkeley, and then equipped with that degree of non-employment, I was able to go to the theater and become a scenic artist. And so that was my day job while I was a young, struggling artist for at least 5 years. I painted for the San Francisco Opera and Ballet companies, as well as Berkeley Rap, all in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I'm from. I'm a native Californian, even though I'm here in Santa Fe. And so that early training, I consider the theater my postgraduate education, because that's where I learned about artifice and illusion and how to paint theatrically, which is then I incorporated all the photographs you'll see, or most of them, except for the insects, are painted backdrops that are using those theatrical techniques. And then, of course, I learned lighting by watching the lighting designers illuminate the sets I was working on. So there's so many things I learned there, as well as the absolute fantasy world of the theater. It was great fun. And
well, I think it's really interesting too that you've embraced some of that in your life. I mean, you have great style, great presence, and I've even been at events that you've had, and you've dressed me. You prepared me. So
stylist.
So I appreciate that.
A career in that,
yeah. So why don't we go ahead and take a look, start with some of the slides. Sure. And if Arturo can put those on the screen for us. Okay. And so yes, this is Jo, but we can go to the next slide. And here you have a stereo camera, but is the background something you painted?
No, it's an old, I was doing a workshop and I asked to get old theater sets to use for the students.
Okay.
That's all. Yeah, and this is my idea of a headshot. I gave it to Arturo for that purpose.
Very good. Most photographers do not like pictures of themselves, so I truly understand. Next slide. So this is the exhibition, the one-person exhibition that you had at MOPA, the Theater of Insects. And do you want to talk a little bit about that show? Because I will give you a moment to talk, but you had wanted to have some shots from the Theater of Insects as preparation for talking about the Echoes exhibition. So I was curious how you were thinking about the Theater of Insects in this.
Okay, yeah, so in the George O'Keeffe exhibit, they included a number of the insect pieces. And what I found interesting is how different the contextualization was. And so Deborah, as the curator of this exhibit, which by the way was one of my favorite installations of this work, which traveled for 5 years. The final show, you opened it, but the final show was at Laycock Abbey in England.
Oh, really?
Yes,
exciting.
at the Talbot Museum.
Uh-huh.
So, you know, that was really an honor, but your exhibition, I think, gave it the best contextualization. It looked the best. And so I was thinking, as a curator, you should maybe comment on how you put the work together, and then we can look at how the O'Keeffe installation differs so greatly.
Well, I think if we go to the next slide, that might help. So one of the advantages that we have being in Balboa Park is that we have a lot of sister museums, and the Natural History Museum has quite a collection of insects, but they also have this early volume, which is where you got your title, The Theater of Insects. And I think the date on this was around the 1600s.
Yeah, I think 1658, something like that.
And so it made a lot of sense to integrate not only this book, which they graciously lent to us, but also some of their insect specimens. And what I really like about your work is that it's painterly, it's beautiful, it's poetic, but it's also about sort of collecting and gathering of these kinds of specimens and just reinterpreting them. And for me, I've always believed and try to show it not only in this exhibition, but some of the other more education-based exhibitions that we do, this marriage of art and science that it so defines what photography is. And that's what I really liked about putting these artifacts together. So if we could go to the next slide. As you can see, the scientists at the museum, at the Natural History Museum, we showed them images, and they actually pulled samples of the insects that would match up. So they really embraced the opportunity as well. And then the other thing I think is really important to be able to talk about is the fact that you were not doing Photoshop, which is going to be important to discuss. But as you also look, before we go there, as you look at the installation shot of the long wall on the bottom of the slide, you can see that there are things that are hung at different angles. So again, the kind of feeling of these artifacts, these specimens placed in different ways for you to view it, rather than just a pure linear fashion, but that they are meant to be placed in these different places.
And I'd like to comment on that. Yeah, so one of the things I was delighted by Deborah's vision of installation here was, if you notice on that long wall, you see one that's very low. So a child, could be at face level with an eye level rather with that little piece. And so there was that integration, but also the small pieces were going up and down the wall as if it was a butterfly going through the room, which is really fun. So it was a playful installation.
And it really, and beautiful as well. I mean, it really was wonderful to be able to see all that work together. So why don't we go to the next slide? And here we have an installation shot from the George O'Keeffe Museum. Can you talk a little bit about where the idea for this came from? Was it something you proposed to them? Was it something they came to you about? I mean, how did it happen?
They contacted me. And oddly enough, I'm here in Santa Fe, but a curator in Chicago contacted this curator at the O'Keeffe and said, you should look at this work. Because the O'Keeffe was doing a project, they still are, where they're pairing artists, contemporary artists, with the O'Keeffe paintings. And every year they do it. This exhibit was from November to end of March of, not this year, but last year. And so it ended in 2019. So what they're doing is trying to recontextualize O'Keeffe's work so that, the viewer is coming to see O'Keeffe's paintings from a fresh perspective because they're seeing how it can relate to contemporary art. And the artist they've had is Ken Price. And I don't know if you know the work of Susan York. She's an amazing sculptor, but she does these monolithic black sculptures, and it's amazing how they integrated that work with the paintings. So each one is very different expression.
And so they, how long did it take to go through the process of matching work, your photographs with the O'Keeffe paintings?
It happened over a course of a year.
Okay.
We prepared for it over a course of a year. I was working on another project at the same time, but I met with the curator and she proposed the idea to me. And so I went back to the studio and I looked at JPEGs of the O'Keeffe paintings and kind of lobbed to her a idea of this echoes, and here's some possible pairings. And then she took it and creatively, put together ideas from that. And we went back and forth, and also it had to do with what's available. And the curator's name is Carolyn Kastner, by the way. Okay. And
So
then,
talk about the title. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, echoes, but I wondered if you had some different ways of thinking about what that title means.
well, it's just that there's, reverberations across like the time period. I'm working, in this time period. She was working in earlier, from the 20s through the 40s or 60s is most of the work in the exhibit. And it's an echo across time, that, as we go through and look at the pairings, you'll see how they kind of go together and how they're different.
I like that concept of echoes through time. And to me, that makes it even stronger. But why don't we go to the next slide?
So these I'm just showing different possible pairings. And this is where, as a curator, you could possibly speak to this. The obvious thing this is a datura flower that I'm working with that's growing just outside the studio here in Santa Fe, a hawk moth, and the hawk moth caterpillar that was eating the datura plant, that I just grabbed from outside the studio and put on the set. So O'Keeffe did several datura plant paintings as well. It's also called Jimson weed. By the way, it's slightly hallucinogenic if you were to ingest it. Who knows what those caterpillars are doing? They're having a good time.
They are.
Yes. So on the lower right, you can see one of O'Keeffe's Jimson weeds, and both the curator, Carolyn, and I thought, well, that's just too easy of a shot, in terms of a pairing. That's about the content. We did one where the content is the same tree, but here on the lower left, I put this pairing of landscape with the being reflected in water, because it seemed to me very much like the background that I painted here.
Yeah. And which is making a very different statement than if you had just put the painting of the flower. And
Exactly.
what it is, it's asking the viewer to think equally about the background, the setting, as it is about the more obvious specific subject matter.
So if we can go back one, and we can quickly look at, so Carolyn chose this petunia. So we can ask ourselves, well, why? And it's not the same flower at all. But we can see that if you look in the background behind the petunia, the modulation of the turquoise into that kind of midnight blue, there's absolutely no reason for that, And if just like in my background, you have that kind of mauvish color going into the blues, and it's this modulation, no reason except for it gives mood and feeling. And it's not about content, but it's this kind of atmospheric enhancement of
and the palette as well, the colors that are chosen by both you and Georgia O'Keeffe. So
Yeah, so that's why the curator went with that, and I thought it was great.
So we've had a question in the past where people would like to understand the size of the work. And and actually it was very intriguing to me because until I couldn't quite tell the first time I looked at your slides why you were showing some of the O'Keeffes so small until I realized they were actually a lot smaller than your photographs. And so, but in this case, your work is running what, about 30 by 40 inches approximately?
In this one, yeah, something like that.
Okay.
And also in terms of these, in the presentation here of the slides that the viewers are seeing, I have them, you know, it's not meant to be to scale.
Okay.
When I put to the comparisons, it's just as a reference.
Okay. So
Yeah.
next, forward on the slides.
Yeah.
And why don't we go forward again?
Yeah.
So here, yeah.
Scale.
And then talk about the placement here of the work. So I can see from the painting to the left, the kind of feel of the branches. And
yeah, let's go to the next slide. It'll be easier to talk about that. Okay, so, oops, I'm sorry. So the piece, we'll have to go back. This is a piece that yeah, there we go. So the curator chose this piece that is on the far left, the large piece, to pair with this tree that I created. And the reason was that mostly the color and some of the linear elements in the piece. And it's called maple tree or maple leaf, but it's very abstract. And then if we go to the next slide, here are some other choices, which would have been pairing a tree with a tree, but they're equally possible. They're all possibles, you know, because my tree called Harvest the Fall, which is this pathetic tree I created, imagining, by the way, it's from 1991. It's a 4x5 negative. And it's imagining, you know, if we cut down all the trees and then we decide we want some, what's it going to look like? You know, it's going to be this kind of pathetic, scabbed together thing that barely bears fruit. And that is the case on this tree on the lower right. That O'Keeffe's painting is basically a dead tree in the local landscape here in New Mexico. And then if you look at the tree on the left, look at that modulated background and how similar that is to my modulated background.
And it's interesting because to see your work in a different context, because the tree that you show is one that I included in the Picturing Eden exhibition and book.
Oh,
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So with a few of your other works as well, but definitely that one.
Yeah.
So, okay, shall we go to the next slide?
Okay, and this just shows you an overall view of the one of the galleries. They tend to hang very spare in that museum. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see a close-up of the pairings from that gallery space. And in this case, this is one of the insect pieces, and you can see that they paired it for the color, and the punch of the color. And what's interesting about O'Keeffe's work is that she has these careful compositions, but there's a real quietude that is balanced by this riotous color and, you know, restraint. If anything, she's restrained. And I tend to be very careful in my compositions as well, and really, you know, refined in how I place things together in a similar way. And here I'm using color to put together very disparate elements and unify them.
So I know that more traditional paintings have, you know, early still life paintings have been very influential in some of your work. Had you thought about Georgia O'Keeffe in relationship to your work before this project?
No. Except for, I have to say, when I was 25 and a young artist, I was given that O'Keeffe monograph. And I studied it, and as I do all the art books that I have in my library, and you can't underestimate how things filter into the brain and become part of your language. But my library is pretty vast.
So as I've been sitting here looking at your image next to the O'Keeffe, it becomes more than just the palette that pairs them. Your work actually is influencing how I'm looking at the O'Keeffe painting. I'm starting to see more figurative shapes begin to emerge. I mean, I see a tree, but at the same time, the white space on the left-hand side becomes more figurative, like the figures in your image. And the original source is a daguerreotype, I think,
Yeah.
that you have worked with. So
yeah, good call.
it's quite lovely. Next slide.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay.
So in the exhibit, the Carolyn Kastner paired this piece on the left of a euphorbia with the piece on the upper right. And I had introduced the piece on the bottom as a possible pairing for the color and the feel of it. And Carolyn does this thing where she does sight lines. So the painting on the upper portion is actually in another room, but as you see the two together by looking through the door of the gallery, you actually see the euphorbia piece. So they're paired in that way. And this piece is one of the more recent ones in the exhibit. The exhibit of my work expands from 1991 to around 2016, I think, or 17, I can't recall.
So this is where you're starting to incorporate more scientific instruments and objects in the works.
Right, this is from a series called Botanical Studies. And they're kind of like notes from the Anthropocene. They're how, man has manipulated plants for thousands of years. And now everything's getting pretty ramped up with genetic engineering. And, it's just my take. I love plants as much as I love insects. And so I wanted to do a series incorporating plants, but this is how I see fit to do it.
So I want to go back to how the choices are made. So you mentioned that are those poppies or the orange flowers on the bottom right, you selected to go with the black scientific piece and the light and the colors behind it. And the curator chose the adobe building, the abstracted building with the leaf. So how did you negotiate that?
Not.
She said, I'm doing this?
No, I believe that curators, is their art, and so, and also there's so many other considerations. You have to realize that in my first series of suggestions to Carolyn, I'm just taking pictures that I think I see fit. And then there's other considerations. Can that be borrowed? Is it available? Have they shown it last year? They want to keep everything fresh. So sometimes it wouldn't be appropriate. It may be on loan to another institution. And Carolyn has her own ideas. So I always defer to the curator. I start as in that environment of the theater, it's all real collaborative. And so you kind of make suggestions and then you really are accepting and honor the people who are making those choices for all the reasons that they have to.
Well, I really want to thank you for understanding that, an exhibition and a book are the art of the curator, because that's exactly what it is. I always feel that I've been given the opportunity to take your ideas, other artists' ideas, and kind of reinterpret them and present them in a way that hopefully gives other levels of engaging with the work, of appreciating the work, and helping oftentimes the artist see something they might not normally have seen themselves. And it really is, it's very exciting. It's not just like putting things up chronologically. It's not just like,
No.
it is all the same creative choices that you make as an artist. But you have to do it and also give balance and credit to the creativity of the individual artist as well.
Right, and curators, I mean, I really think they can see work so differently than the artist, because you have to remember we're so subjectively mired in making it that, you know, it's a dance. You have to, in order to make it, you have to get subjective and go under and do it because, well, the work leads you to make it. But then it takes someone like a curator to go, this really relates to this or that, and, you know, or this is how I see it. And to respect that and have fun with it. And it's really fun.
It is.
Yeah.
Yes. Next slide.
Okay, this is just another piece that was in the exhibit, and some possible pairings that I just suggested. And in the end, they were just, there was a grouping of my works in a kind of single gallery. But there were pieces similar to this. I think the one on the upper right was in another gallery. So as the viewers going through, then they could see that the O'Keeffe piece, and then a gallery later see something similar. And that was part of the fun too, that Carolyn, in this installation, there was no big, you know, definitive, this is a show with, you know, O'Keeffe and Jo Whaley. It was like the viewer goes, what's that doing here? you know, it was so interspersed that as the viewer moved through, they were, you know, asked to question and discover, and that was part of the fun. And then so the larger grouping of my work was way in the back of the museum, or towards the end, so that then, you know, they would see how it all came together.
So how much do you pre-visualize your work, you know, in a single image? Because you have to put effort into painting the backdrop, the colors, the movement that you create. So do you create a backdrop and then do a number of different things in front of it? Or do you, you know, have objects and sketch out some things and then create, or is it a mix?
Well, I have many backgrounds for, you know, that I work with, that I've accumulated over the years. And in the 90s, I probably painted about 10 big backdrops that can be turned upside down even, you know, and shifted and changed. And so I just have them on hand. And then if I have a particular idea that requires a backdrop that I don't have on hand, like the one with the datura, I'll say, I got to paint it. And I got to paint it before those datura flowers are past their prime in the garden, you know. And so there's some of that dance going on. And then I'll get an idea, you know, it starts with a vague notion, Deb. That's the word, vague notion. And then I always think the work leads you. You start at one place, and you just, it's more of a journey, a discovery, or as David Hockney says, I grope my way towards the image. You know, I just always feel that way, you know, you trial and error, but you start with a vague notion, of course, or something that inspires you. Like with the plants, it's plant-driven design, you know, I got to start there. And then the rest of it kind of comes together as I'm groping in the studio.
So as part of that grope, I don't want to dissect too much, but for example, the yellowish water in the test tube, did you color it?
Yeah, so, you know, as you mentioned earlier, I'm not a big I'm very good at Photoshop at this point. It was like learning Russian, but I'm there. But my roots are in analog photography. And so it's easier for me to do everything on the set than to say, oh, I'm going to composite this in Photoshop. That is like the biggest boring thing for me to do, is to sit in front of a computer trying to composite. So in this piece, I felt I wanted that yellow-green leaf to continue through the loop of that chemistry tube. So all I did is took, you know, like a watercolor dye I have in the studio and popped it in the water and, you know, got the right color. So this is a straight shot. And the only thing I did, this is now in 2016, something like that. So it's Photoshopped. I did it with a digital camera, but everything is straight, except for if you look at the sky behind the iris, this is a gray painted backdrop, and I just added some of that mauve color to tie it in with the flower through Photoshop. So that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Should we go to the next slide?
So the pairing here, you can see it's a small piece. This is from 1994, I think, early, you know, it's an early piece. And then they paired it with that swirling abstraction of a rose of O'Keeffe's. And they chose that for the color. And this image on the left was done pre-Photoshop. It was done in the 1990s, as I mentioned, and it's done with a 4x5 view camera, which all the early still life was, with film. And so those snails are alive on the set. They are alive and they're crawling. And so I basically had to arrange everything, and you'll notice there's one even on the magnifying glass. Being careful about my composition, of course. I had to arrange everything, then go in the garden, get the snails, put them on the set, and wait until they position themselves, right? And then I use strobes, so I'd flash it, I'd take the picture, and then all the snails would go into their shell. So I had to wait until they came back out. I maybe did 4 shots to get the one that I liked best. And, you know, it was fun.
Well, and it's amazing too that you found such a variety of sizes of snails too. So
Well,
I think you had way too many snails in your garden, I must say. Yeah. Next slide.
So this was just something that was fun, where they paired it, you know, O'Keeffe collected a lot of bones. And in fact, the O'Keeffe Museum not only has her house in Abiquiu, but they have all her paints, her artifact collections that she used for paintings. It's quite a rich archive that they have. And so they like to display some of those things, and they chose to put my little insect pelvis piece in with the bones.
So it's a lot like you, Jo. You have a lot of artifacts and objects that you have collected. And but for anybody that does get to go to the George O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe, if you can get into the archive, it's well worth it, because they will open a drawer and it will be rocks, just rocks that she collected. It will be her paint tubes, used ones. They'll pull another one over and it's her sneakers. Right. And then they'll open another drawer and it'll be her clothes, because she was actually a very good seamstress. And, you know, all of those kind of Japanese-esque clothes she designed herself. And and bones. And so these were all important, just as the objects that you collect are so important to the final works that you create. So.
Yeah, and the fun thing about being older is that you have things dating back from your 20s, you know, that as she did, she just kept, you know, you just keep your stuff, I guess. You know, because then you have a different relationship as time goes on, or I need that something, and it's part of your archive, or your, it's just like some painters will, you know, keep their favorite paintbrush, which they have at the O'Keeffe Museum.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they become your friends.
Next slide.
So this is that archive that Deb is talking about, and you can't see it under the windows. That's a tabletop, and then all the drawers are right down below, and it spans that whole wall. And this was a pairing that was done. There's 2 tree paintings with one of my pieces in the middle, and it just has to do with a color and also those linear forms that are going through.
So they even installed in the archive.
Yes.
Very
Yeah,
nice.
and yeah, I like this pairing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it a lot too. Scale
So,
and everything, yeah.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, next slide.
So this is just a little tiny piece on the right, as we saw it in with the tree photograph. It's very small, but it echoes again to, it's a close-up of an iris, but it echoes to the sense of this insect piece that they installed. And this was a very large piece, taking up a whole wall. And it just has a similar quality in terms of the light and the colors. But I don't know, what do we want to say about this, Deb?
I love it. I mean, I love the pairing. I like the sense of the difference in scale, but there's that same sense of intimacy that I really like, that you're being shown kind of a negative and a positive on the moth wing, that there's a divide, but there's all of this rich detail. So it's really lovely.
So one thing I'll bring up is, it was asked of me, you know, how O'Keeffe's, you know, view of nature is so different than mine. And I think that's one of those separations of the time period, because she's celebrating nature. She's in a time period when we didn't have this kind of black cloud of cement over our heads of climate change and, you know, all the things, all the trappings that come with that, and the kind of subtle background anxieties in our relationship to nature. And so she's able to just look and gloriously, you know, portray it and celebrate it. Whereas my work, I have to, because of being in this time period, I have to look at nature with an honest eye and say, things aren't right, you know. And I love nature, and I'm inspired by it, and I'm a careful observer of it. But, you know, we're in a uneasy time period in our relationship with nature. So my work is reflecting that.
Well, there's also a sexuality, a sensuality with her painting as well, though, that brings sometimes a little bit of a, at least in this image, a little bit of darker feel to the work. Her palette in general tends to be lighter most often, but also there's as you were saying, there's a real difference in feel to her city work when she was in New York City versus, you know, when she's out here in the wide open and special light of New Mexico. So yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we're in different times.
Definitely. Next slide.
Okay.
And this one I think shows it even more, where you're showing that dried dying leaf with the rusted background of metal, you know, that's distressed. And
yeah, and you know, on her, this is actually an outtake. It's one that the curator and I both wanted to put in, but it didn't fit, you know, we didn't ran out of space, as is always the case, right? And, but we both liked it, and it really does show the difference in terms of those relationships to nature.
Mhm.
And on the George O'Keeffe side, you see that modulation in the background, which is very similar to my painted backdrops.
Mhm.
And here I'm using a found backdrop that's, I call them accidental paintings. It's an old piece of metal. And it's a piece of metal that's been taken halfway back by nature through rust and whatnot, which is one of my strategies. And one thing if we have time here that I wanted to note with O'Keeffe and why her work can work so well with photographs is that most artists have their brush stroke is a signature. Like, think of, if you see a Franz Hall's painting, you know it's Franz Hall by those quick brush strokes that he uses. So many painters have these brush strokes that are very signature-like. And with O'Keeffe, it's the opposite. She carefully modulates the tones, and the brush strokes smooths them out. So the point is that the brush strokes are hardly there or visible to where it becomes anonymous in her terms of that signature. And I see photography actually as a painter, when I was trying to decide whether to stay in painting or go to photography, that's one of the things I liked, was that photography was anonymous, that anybody could take the photograph, but it was just what was in front of the camera that became particular to a person or a vision, let's say.
Great.
And so I think that's why the pairings can be so kind of complementary. And as Andy, let's maybe go to the next one, just,
Yep.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I thought Andy Grunberg in your conversation last week brought up was how today photography is seamlessly carried into the art world and into museums, where when we were all younger and starting out, as you know, Deb, photography was not really shown a lot in this, at least in the 70s, and certainly color photography wasn't even considered, you know, kosher to do color photography, because there was longevity issues that
Right. Is it going to last? Is it? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when, you know, I viewed the conversation from last week, I think that was last week, right? Yeah, I was just really delighted that he brought that up, because our world has changed so much, and where we can put these two mediums together and they can speak to each other, and it's fully there.
So let's go on to the next slide. Oh, so why don't you take us through your studio and your space, and then we can take questions.
Yeah, so this is just my studio, which is large, and we're out in the country a little bit here, so I got nice views just outside of the mountains, and it's very pleasant. Let me say that, as opposed to the factories I used to work in East Oakland. Big difference, you know, looking at the wasteland, industrial wasteland. Back then. And you can see I have a big printer, Canon printer, and for this show, this is me working on the O'Keeffe show, and I had to have all the early negatives drum scanned and then print them on that printer so everything was consistent. And I would say I switched to digital capture around, I don't know, in the 2000s, maybe 2006 is when I really started getting exclusively into digital capture.
Well, the advantage there for you is you can see the image immediately. You know, if you're dealing with negatives, you have to have them processed, and then you get to see what the result was, unless you were using Polaroid.
I did. I had 5 grants from the Polaroid Corporation to work on that big 20 by 24 camera in New York. And the fairy godmother of Polaroid gave me boxes of Polaroid films so I could test my sets. But you're right, Deb, there's nothing like how it shooting digitally, because what I do is I tether my laptop to my camera. So I immediately see not like what I'm shooting. So I actually take the photograph, look on my laptop, I can blow it up to see what's in focus and what's not, which you can't really tell that well on a Polaroid, you're guessing. And then I make set changes right then and there. Whereas before, it'd be a week before I got the film back. And you know, you lose the enthusiasm of the moment, or the creative flow, let's call it.
So I think that's the last slide, if I'm correct.
Yeah. Yes.
And what I wanted to do before we take questions is just mention your most recent book, The Santa Fe Scottish Rite Temple, which I have here. It's a very big, heavy book, but it's lovely. When we were talking in preparation for this, you told me about this project where you got into the Scottish Rite Temple, and they had all of these marvelous painted backdrops. And so not only did you take me into a secret society that I'd always questioned, and was curious about, but you also made some beautiful, beautiful pictures. And so I do encourage everyone to get this book. It's fabulous and great essays. So everyone, if you want to ask questions, or feel free to turn on your video. And so do we have anybody? Jump in. Okay, I'm not hearing anybody jump in. So what I will say is it's been great talking to you, Jo, and I really miss seeing you, but here we are on Zoom, the new way of seeing each other, the new neighbors. And I'm eager to see the new work that you might create, especially after experiencing the kind of work of George O'Keeffe and juxtaposed with your own work. Bob Posen, did you have a question? No? Okay, I saw your face there. And next week, my guest is Matthew Brandt, LA-based photographer. Yeah. So I encourage you all to come back with us. And if everyone wants to applaud and thank, I believe you have, if you go down to the bottom and go to reactions, you can give thumbs up. And thank you, Jo. It's been great.
Thank you,
Okay. All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Thumbs up. Thumbs up.
Okay.
Thumbs
Very
up.
good.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone.
Very,
Thank you,
very much.
Jo.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.